Imagine standing on a tarmac in the late 1940s, looking up at an aircraft so unfathomably massive that it literally blocked out the sun. You are looking at a wingspan of 230 feet, a tail sitting almost 50 feet in the air, and a fuselage packed with enough raw destructive power to erase a major metropolitan area from the map. When its engines fired up, the ground did not just shake, it practically liquefied under the acoustic assault of 6 massive radial engines, later joined by 4 jet engines. They called it the Peacemaker, but there was nothing peaceful about it. It was the Convair B-36, the magnesium overcast, the ultimate big stick of the early Cold War, and a machine explicitly designed to fly from the continental United States, drop a nuclear payload on Moscow, and fly back. Yet, despite being the backbone of American strategic deterrence during the most dangerous years of the 20th century, it never dropped a bomb in anger. And today, it is largely forgotten. Welcome to the channel, where we strip away the propaganda and dissect the brutal arithmetic of military history, strategy, and the machines that shaped our world. If you want to understand the cold, hard logic of global conflict and the engineering marvels that defined it, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the ranks. To understand the sheer audacity of the B-36, you have to completely forget the Cold War for a moment and rewind the clock to April 1941. The United States was not yet in the Second World War, but the situation in Europe was looking incredibly grim. France had fallen in a matter of weeks, crushed under the treads of German panzer divisions. Great Britain was standing alone, absorbing the daily punishment of the Blitz. In Washington, military planners were sweating bullets over a very real, very terrifying hypothetical scenario. What happens if Britain falls? How exactly do you project American power across the Atlantic Ocean when your only potential staging grounds are flying the swastika? It is the same strategic nightmare the Union Navy faced during the American Civil War when trying to blockade the vast southern coastline, but scaled up to a global three-dimensional theater. You cannot win a war if you cannot reach the enemy. The Army Air Corps, under the visionary leadership of General Henry Hap Arnold, issued a requirement that bordered on science fiction for the era. They wanted an intercontinental bomber capable of a top speed of 400 miles per hour, a cruising speed of 275 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 45,000 feet, and a maximum range of 12,000 miles. It had to be able to take off from bases in Maine or Newfoundland, fly across the Atlantic, drop 10,000 pounds of high explosives on Berlin, and return home without refueling. To put that into perspective, the state-of-the-art bomber of the day, the B-17 Flying Fortress, had an operational range of about 2,000 miles with a standard bomb load. The military was essentially asking the aviation industry to skip an entire generation of technological evolution and build a flying dreadnought. Convair, known then as Consolidated Vultee, stepped up to the plate with a design that was nothing short of megalomaniacal. The initial blueprints called for an aircraft so heavy that the landing gear alone required tires measuring over 9 feet in diameter. The wings were so incredibly thick, measuring 7.5 feet at the root, that flight engineers could literally crawl through a pressurized tunnel inside the wing during flight to service the engines. This was not just a heavy bomber, it was a strategic facility with wings. But as we know from the history of military procurement, ambition often writes checks that reality takes a long time to cash. The United States entered the war, and priorities shifted. The military needed thousands of B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses immediately, not a handful of experimental Leviathans years down the line. The B-36 project was pushed to the back burner, simmering away in the research and development phase while the Second World War raged and eventually ended without it. But when the dust settled in 1945, the geopolitical landscape had fundamentally fractured. The Axis powers were destroyed, but a new, far more formidable adversary stood astride Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with the largest conventional land army the world had ever seen. We are talking about an absolute juggernaut. By 1946, the Red Army maintained millions of men under arms, organized into over 175 combat-ready divisions, heavily mechanized and deeply entrenched in the territories they had occupied. In stark contrast, the United States and its Western allies were rapidly demobilizing, desperate to bring the boys home and transition back to a peacetime economy. The conventional force disparity in Europe was staggering, and if Joseph Stalin decided to order his tank armies to push toward the English Channel, there was very little conventional Allied armor or infantry standing in their way that could stop them. How do you deter a massive, battle-hardened conventional army when your own forces are shrinking by the day? You rely on the ultimate trump card, the atomic bomb. But a weapon of mass destruction is completely useless if you do not have a reliable delivery system. The United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, but the strategic reality of delivering them was a logistical nightmare. The B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, simply did not have the legs to reach the Soviet heartland from North America. To hit Moscow or the industrial centers beyond the Ural Mountains, B-29s would have to be stationed at forward operating bases in Europe or the Middle East. Those bases were highly vulnerable to Soviet preemptive strikes, sabotage, or being overrun by a sudden conventional offensive. Furthermore, the Soviets were not sitting idle. In 1947, they shocked the West by unveiling the Tupolev Tu-4, a near-perfect reverse-engineered copy of the B-29, giving them their own strategic delivery capability. The American strategic advantage was evaporating rapidly. Enter the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, and the resurrection of the B-36. The newly formed United States Air Force realized that the only way to guarantee a credible nuclear deterrent was to base the bombers on American soil, far beyond the reach of the Red Army and the Soviet Air Force. The old 1941 requirement for an intercontinental bomber was suddenly the most urgent strategic necessity of the Cold War. The B-36 was pulled from the back burner and thrust into the spotlight. It was the only aircraft in the world, on the drawing board or in the air, that could carry an 86,000-pound payload of nuclear gravity bombs from bases in Texas, the Dakotas, or Maine, fly over the North Pole, penetrate Soviet airspace, and return. It was a brutal, uncompromising piece of engineering designed for one singular purpose: the complete annihilation of the enemy's capacity to wage war. Let us break down the staggering industrial and mechanical reality of this machine. To power a beast that weighed over 400,000 pounds fully loaded, Convair utilized 6 Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major engines. These were not your average aircraft engines. The Wasp Major was a 28-cylinder, 4-row radial engine, producing up to 3,800 horsepower. It was the largest, most complex piston engine ever mass-produced for aviation. Because the B-36 used a pusher configuration, with the propellers mounted on the trailing edge of the wings to reduce drag and improve aerodynamic efficiency, the engines faced severe cooling problems. Normal aircraft engines get blasted with cold air from the front, but the Wasp Majors on the B-36 were buried inside the wings, suffocating in their own heat. Carburetor icing was a constant, terrifying threat. At high altitudes, the cold, thin air would freeze the moisture in the carburetors, choking the engines. The flight engineers had to constantly monitor temperatures, adjusting cowl flaps and fuel mixtures in a desperate, endless battle against the laws of thermodynamics. The maintenance required to keep this fleet in the air was staggering, a logistical footprint that rivaled the deployment of a small naval task force. Each of those 6 engines had 56 spark plugs. That is 336 spark plugs per aircraft. After almost every long-duration mission, mechanics had to pull and replace them because the leaded aviation fuel fouled them so quickly. It was a wrench-turner's worst nightmare. And the fuel consumption was astronomical. The wings contained tanks holding over 21,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. To put that in perspective, a B-36 carried enough fuel to fill the gas tanks of roughly 1,000 average American cars. When a wing of Peacemakers took off, they were essentially flying tank farms. The human element of operating the B-36 was just as extreme as the mechanics. Under the doctrine developed by General Curtis LeMay, who took command of SAC in 1948, the bomber crews had to be ready to fly combat missions that could last up to 40 hours. 40 hours inside a vibrating, deafening aluminium tube, flying at 40,000 feet, where the outside temperature was 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The aircraft was divided into 2 pressurized compartments, the forward flight deck and the aft crew compartment, connected by an 85-foot-long pressurized tunnel. To move between the sections, crew members had to lie flat on a wheeled cart and pull themselves along a rope. Inside the aft section, there were 6 bunks and a small galley, allowing the 15-man crew to sleep in shifts. The psychological toll of knowing your mission was to fly over the top of the world, drop a weapon that would kill hundreds of thousands of people, and then try to nurse a damaged, freezing aircraft back to a base in Alaska, was a heavy burden that defined the culture of the Strategic Air Command. LeMay understood that a deterrent is only effective if the enemy believes you are capable and willing to use it. He transformed SAC from a demobilized, relaxed post-war flying club into a ruthlessly efficient, constantly alert war machine. He ordered maximum effort missions, simulated bombing runs over American cities that mimicked the radar profiles of Soviet targets, and pushed the B-36 crews to the absolute breaking point. He was testing the doctrine of massive retaliation. The Soviet Union had to look at the B-36 and understand that no matter how many tanks they rolled into Germany, their own cities, their own factories, and their own leadership would be turned to radioactive glass within 24 hours. The B-36 was the physical manifestation of American industrial might and strategic, uncompromising will. Yet for all its size, for all its range, and for all its apocalyptic payload capacity, the B-36 was born into an era of terrifyingly rapid technological transition. The propeller-driven era was dying, and the jet age was roaring to life. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, intelligence reports began filtering back to Washington that chilled the blood of Air Force planners. The Soviets were not just building copies of American bombers, they were developing interceptors that threatened to render the magnesium overcast obsolete before it even reached its prime. The skies over Eastern Europe and Asia were about to be filled with swept-wing jet-powered fighters armed with heavy cannons. The B-36 was a heavyweight boxer stepping into a ring where the opponent was suddenly armed with a sniper rifle. Faced with the terrifying reality of Soviet MiG-15s tearing through the skies over the Korean peninsula, Convair and the United States Air Force had to perform radical surgery on their prize fighter. The B-36 was simply too slow to survive in a sky dominated by swept-wing jet interceptors. The solution was a perfect example of brute force Cold War engineering, strapping 4 General Electric J-47 turbojet engines to the outer wings, creating the iconic 6-turning and 4-burning configuration. These were the exact same jet engines powering the F-86 Sabre fighter, housed in twin pods near the wingtips. This modification birthed the B-36D model and pushed the aircraft's top speed to roughly 435 miles per hour at high altitude. But this modification introduced a logistical nightmare that perfectly illustrates the sheer mechanical stubbornness of the era. Jet engines are designed to burn JP4 jet fuel, a kerosene-based propellant, while the 6 massive radial engines required high-octane, heavily leaded aviation gasoline. Because redesigning the entire wing to incorporate separate jet fuel tanks was deemed too expensive and time-consuming, engineers simply plumbed the jet engines into the existing aviation gas tanks. Running turbojets on leaded avgas is a mechanical sin. The lead deposits rapidly fouled the turbine blades, drastically reducing the lifespan of the jet engines and requiring constant, grueling maintenance. It was a desperate stopgap measure to keep a propeller-driven dinosaur relevant in the jet age. But speed was only one half of the survival equation. To defend against Soviet fighters, the B-36 was equipped with the most complex and heavily armed defensive network ever installed on a bomber. It was a flying porcupine, bristling with 16 M24 A1 20mm cannons. These were not manually aimed machine guns like those found on World War II bombers. They were housed in 6 retractable, remote-controlled turrets, plus fixed nose and tail turrets, all linked to a state-of-the-art radar-guided fire control system. To reduce aerodynamic drag during the long cruise to the target, the fuselage turrets were hidden behind snap-action metal doors. When the radar detected an incoming threat, these doors would snap open, and the twin cannon turrets would rise into position, ready to throw a wall of high-explosive incendiary shells at any approaching MiG. On paper, it was an impenetrable fortress of firepower. In reality, it was an operational disaster. How do you defend a target the size of a football field, moving at a fraction of the speed of an incoming interceptor? You rely on technology. But the technology of the late 1940s was fundamentally incompatible with the physical environment of the B-36. The remote control system relied on thousands of fragile glass vacuum tubes. When the 6 Pratt & Whitney Wasp major engines were running at full military power, they generated a low-frequency vibration that shook the entire airframe violently. This vibration, combined with the extreme cold of high-altitude flight, literally rattled the vacuum tubes to pieces. The radar systems would fail, the turret motors would freeze, and the defensive grid would collapse. The Air Force was slowly realizing a bitter historical truth. Just as the 8th Air Force learned over the skies of Schweinfurt in 1943, where unescorted B-17 flying fortresses were slaughtered by German fighters despite their heavy defensive armament, an unescorted bomber, no matter how many guns it carries, is ultimately a sitting duck against a coordinated fighter defense. We were building a modern Spanish armada, a fleet of massive, heavily armed galleons, hoping they would not encounter the nimble, fast-moving fireships of the Soviet air defense forces. The ultimate justification for this massive, vulnerable platform was its payload. The B-36 was the only aircraft in the American inventory capable of carrying the first generation of thermonuclear weapons, specifically the Mark 17 hydrogen bomb. This was not a bomb, it was a weapon of planetary reshaping. The Mark 17 was 24 feet long, over 5 feet in diameter, and weighed a staggering 39,500 pounds. It had a destructive yield of 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. To fit this apocalyptic cylinder inside the B-36, armourers had to remove the bulkheads between 2 of the 4 bomb bays, creating a single massive cavern in the belly of the beast. What happens when you drop a 15-megaton Sun onto a city from an aircraft that can barely break 400 miles per hour? You risk vaporizing your own crew. The blast wave and thermal radiation from a 15-megaton detonation expand outward at terrifying speeds. For the crew of a B-36, dropping the Mark 17 was essentially a suicide mission, unless they executed a flawless escape maneuver. The moment the 39,000-pound weapon left the shackles, the aircraft would violently pitch upward due to the sudden loss of weight. The pilot then had to throw the massive bomber into a steep diving turn, pushing the airframe to its absolute structural limits, desperately trying to put enough slant range between the aluminum fuselage and the expanding sphere of nuclear fire. It is the exact same tactical dilemma faced by World War I artillerymen executing a creeping barrage. Miscalculate the timing or the distance, and you are obliterated by your own firepower. Because the B-36 never dropped a bomb in combat, its true battlefield record is written in the blood and frozen wreckage of its training missions. To understand the terrifying reality of operating this machine, we have to look at the events of February 13, 1950. A B-36B, serial number 44-92075, commanded by Captain Harold Barry, took off from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. The mission, designated Flight 075, was a grueling simulated nuclear strike. They were to fly down the coast of Canada, drop a dummy nuclear weapon off the coast of California, and land at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. Deep inside the bomb bay sat a Mark IV atomic bomb. It contained a dummy lead core instead of a plutonium pit, meaning it could not initiate a nuclear chain reaction, but it was packed with 5,000 pounds of conventional high explosives and natural uranium. 17 hours into the flight, cruising at 15,000 feet off the coast of British Columbia, the unforgiving environment violently exposed the B-36's fatal flaws. The aircraft flew into a brutal Arctic weather front. The temperature plummeted, and heavy freezing rain began to coat the wings. But the real danger was in the engine nacelles. The pusher configuration meant the carburetor intakes were highly susceptible to ice accumulation. Ice began to choke the massive radial engines, starving them of air. Without warning, engine number 1 burst into flames. Captain Barry ordered it shut down, and the propeller feathered. Minutes later, engine number 2 began shooting long tongues of fire into the night sky. It, too, was shut down. Then, engine number 5 lost all power. The crew was now flying a 300,000-pound aircraft, heavily coated in ice, on 3 failing engines, in the dead of night, over the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Canadian wilderness. The aircraft was steadily losing altitude, and the remaining engines were vibrating so violently they threatened to tear themselves off the wings. When the ultimate weapon of national deterrence becomes a flaming, uncontrollable liability over friendly territory, what is the protocol? You dump the payload. Captain Barry knew they could not attempt a crash landing with 5,000 pounds of high explosives and radioactive material in the belly. He ordered the bomb bay doors opened. The freezing slipstream roared into the fuselage as the bombardier released the Mark IV. The weapon fell into the dark waters of the inside passage. Upon impact, the conventional explosives detonated, creating a massive flash that briefly illuminated the storm clouds, marking the first Broken Arrow incident, the loss of a nuclear weapon in American military history. With the aircraft still losing altitude and heading toward the mountains, Captain Barry gave the bailout order. It was midnight, and the outside temperature was 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. 17 men jumped from the dying bomber into pitch blackness, descending into the frozen, uncharted wilderness of Princess Royal Island. The aircraft flew on autopilot for a few more minutes before slamming into the side of Mount Cologuet, completely disintegrating upon impact. The survival situation for the crew on the ground was a nightmare of exposure, frostbite, and isolation. Despite a massive search and rescue operation launched by the American and Canadian militaries, 5 crew members died in the freezing wilderness. Flight 075 proved a grim reality to the planners at the Strategic Air Command. The B-36 did not need Soviet MiGs to destroy it, as the sheer complexity of the aircraft, combined with the brutal environments it was forced to operate in, was lethal enough. This devastating loss forced a harsh reckoning within the highest echelons of the Pentagon. The Peacemaker was an engineering marvel of its time, a bridge between the propeller-driven armadas of the Second World War and the impending reality of intercontinental ballistic missiles. But it was a magnificent dinosaur, and the climate of the Cold War was changing too rapidly for it to adapt. Intelligence photos of new Soviet surface-to-air missile sites, known as the SA-1 Guild, confirmed that altitude and darkness were no longer a guarantee of survival. The jet age was demanding a completely new paradigm, a swept-wing, all-jet bomber that could fly higher, significantly faster, and actually outrun the blast wave of its own thermonuclear payloads. The writing on the wall was spelled out in jet exhaust, and the United States Air Force knew it had to pivot. But you cannot simply conjure a fleet of jet bombers out of thin air. The B-52 Stratofortress was still in its infancy, suffering through its own agonizing developmental growing pains. Therefore, the strategic burden, the absolute necessity of holding the Soviet Union at risk of total annihilation, remained squarely on the broad magnesium shoulders of the B-36. This creates a fascinating paradox in military history, where a weapon system is universally acknowledged as obsolete for its primary combat role, yet it remains the most critical strategic asset in the nation's arsenal. How do you utilize a vulnerable platform when the survival of the free world depends on its credibility? You change the mission profile, and you exploit the one advantage the B-36 still held over everything else in the sky, which was its sheer, unrelenting endurance. Enter the RB-36, the strategic reconnaissance variant that transformed the lumbering bomber into the most audacious spy plane of the early Cold War. Long before the U-2 Dragon Lady or the SR-71 Blackbird, the United States desperately needed to know what was happening behind the Iron Curtain. Were the Soviets massing tank armies in East Germany? Were they building new bomber bases in Siberia? The only way to find out was to go look, and the RB-36 was the only aircraft with the legs to do it. The Air Force stripped out much of the defensive armament and the nuclear payload, replacing them with a massive pressurized camera compartment manned by specialized photographic technicians. We are not talking about standard handheld cameras here. The RB-36 carried an array of up to 23 separate cameras, including the legendary K-38 and K-42 systems. But the crown jewel of this intelligence-gathering effort was the gigantic Boston camera. This optical leviathan weighed over 6,000 pounds and featured a 240-inch focal length. To put that optical power into perspective, an RB-36, cruising at 45,000 feet, could take a photograph of a golf course, and the photo interpreters back at Strategic Air Command headquarters could count the golf balls on the putting green. These reconnaissance missions, often flown under the highly classified Project Homerun, were incredibly dangerous. RB-36 crews would take off from bases in Great Britain or Alaska, deliberately penetrate sovereign Soviet airspace, and fly thousands of miles across hostile territory, mapping radar installations, airfields, and industrial centers. They were flying unarmed or lightly armed, massive targets directly into the teeth of the Soviet air defense forces. The tension inside that pressurized tube must have been suffocating. Every time the radar warning receiver buzzed, indicating a Soviet ground control intercept radar had painted them, the crew knew that MiG-15s were scrambling to hunt them down. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, played at 40,000 feet, relying on the cover of darkness and the extreme altitude to survive. This mirrors the harrowing reconnaissance flights of the Second World War, where stripped-down, unarmed P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires relied purely on speed and altitude to photograph German positions before the Normandy invasion. But here, the scale was continental, and the penalty for failure was not just getting shot down, but potentially sparking World War III. But the battles the B-36 fought were not just against the freezing Arctic weather or Soviet interceptors. Its most vicious combat occurred in the committee rooms of Washington, D.C., in a political bloodbath known as the Revolt of the Admirals. In 1949, the United States military was facing severe budget cuts under the Truman administration. The newly independent Air Force and the venerable United States Navy were locked in a zero-sum game for funding and strategic relevance in the nuclear age. The Navy believed that the future of nuclear deterrence lay in massive supercarriers, specifically the planned USS United States, which would launch heavy attack aircraft carrying atomic bombs. The Air Force, led by figures like Secretary Stuart Symington, argued that the B-36 was a far more cost-effective and immediate solution for intercontinental strike capability. When Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson abruptly cancelled the USS United States supercarrier to funnel more money into the B-36 program, the Navy establishment erupted. High-ranking admirals, including Arthur Radford, launched a brutal public relations and congressional campaign to destroy the reputation of the B-36. They leaked anonymous memos claiming the bomber was a billion-dollar blunder, a slow, vulnerable, obsolete piece of junk that could not survive against modern fighters, and even insinuated that political corruption was behind the procurement contracts. The inter-service rivalry reached a fever pitch, resulting in dramatic congressional hearings where Air Force generals and Navy admirals openly attacked each other's strategic doctrines. This bitter infighting was eerily similar to the fierce bureaucratic warfare between General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz during the Pacific Campaign of World War II, where the Army and Navy constantly fought over resources, strategic direction, and command authority. Ultimately, the Air Force won the bureaucratic war of 1949, proving that the B-36 was, at that specific moment in time, the only viable weapon for massive retaliation. But the Navy's criticisms regarding the bomber's vulnerability were not entirely wrong. They were just premature. The political victory ensured the survival of the B-36, but it also unleashed a logistical nightmare that strained the American military infrastructure to its breaking point. You do not simply park an aircraft with a 230-foot wingspan and a maximum takeoff weight of over 410,000 pounds on a standard runway. The sheer ground pressure exerted by the initial single-wheel main landing gear design was so immense that it literally crushed the concrete of most military airfields. The aircraft would sink into the tarmac like a boot in wet mud. Convair had to hastily redesign the landing gear, replacing the massive single tires, which were 56 inches in diameter and the largest ever manufactured, with 4 wheel bogies to distribute the weight. Even with this modification, the Air Force had to embark on a massive multi-billion-dollar construction program to upgrade its bomber bases. Runways had to be lengthened to over 10,000 feet and poured with concrete up to 19 inches thick to withstand the punishing weight of the Peacemaker. This logistical burden extended deep into the industrial supply chain. To keep the weight down on such a massive airframe, Convair utilized thousands of pounds of magnesium in the skin and structure of the B-36. Magnesium is incredibly light, but it is also notoriously difficult to work with, highly susceptible to corrosion, and, most terrifyingly, highly flammable. When a magnesium fire starts, it burns with a blinding white heat and is nearly impossible to extinguish with conventional methods. Water only accelerates a magnesium fire. This meant that every time a mechanic worked on the aircraft, every time a spark was generated near the skin, there was a risk of a catastrophic conflagration. The maintenance crews, already exhausted by the endless spark plug changes and jet engine fouling, had to treat the airframe itself like an unexploded bomb. The logistical tail required to keep the B-36 fleet operational was a staggering economic drain, rivaling the massive supply chains required to sustain the Union Army during the siege of Petersburg in the American Civil War, where miles of dedicated railroads and deep-water ports had to be constructed just to keep the war machine fed. So how do we evaluate the legacy of the Convair B-36 Peacemaker? It was an aircraft plagued by engine fires, structural limitations, and a technological paradigm shift that rendered it tactically obsolete within years of its introduction. It was a logistical nightmare that devoured maintenance hours and defense budgets. Yet it never dropped a bomb in anger, and not a single B-36 was ever lost to enemy fire. In the brutal arithmetic of nuclear deterrence, this is not a failure. It is the ultimate definition of success. The B-36 was the big stick that Theodore Roosevelt spoke of, scaled up to apocalyptic proportions. It stood in the gap during the most vulnerable years of the Cold War, between the demobilization of the American military after World War II and the deployment of the B-52 and intercontinental ballistic missiles in the late 1950s. The Soviets knew the B-36 was flawed, but they also knew that if even a fraction of the fleet made it through their air defenses, the Soviet Union would cease to exist as a functioning industrial state. That terrifying calculation, enforced by the rumbling drone of 10 engines and the dedication of the men who flew them, kept the Cold War from turning hot. The Peacemaker retired in 1959, quietly sent to the boneyards, cut up for scrap, and largely forgotten by the public. But its shadow still looms over modern strategic doctrine, a testament to an era when peace was maintained not by treaties, but by the credible threat of absolute, world-ending violence. Deterrence is a chilling paradox, where the creation of the ultimate weapon is justified only by the hope that its mere existence will ensure it is never used. We build machines of apocalypse to buy the time necessary for diplomacy to work? Now, we want to hear your tactical assessment in the comments below. What do you believe was the primary reason the B-36 was ultimately retired from service? Was it A, the introduction of Soviet surface-to-air missiles and high-speed jet interceptors that made its mission survivability nearly zero? Was it B, the staggering logistical costs and constant mechanical failures, particularly the engine fires, that made it too expensive to maintain? Or was it C, the successful development and deployment of the far superior B-52 Stratofortress, which could perform the same mission more efficiently? Drop your answer, A, B, or C, in the comments and let us debate the history.